New Jersey's Private Sector Help Desk webinar, and it's now my privilege to introduce Joe Picciano. Joe is the Deputy Director for Preparedness for the Office of Homeland Security and Preparedness for New Jersey, and he is also the All Hazards Consortium Board President. Joe?
Thank you, Laura. I would just like to introduce Charlie McKenna, our Homeland Security Advisor for the state of New Jersey. Charlie's been with us for 2 years, and from the beginning, he really did focus on the private sector, and he did it in a number of ways, but I would say, and if you look at it in 3 ways, it's the best examples I can give you. One, he's refined some existing programs we had and helped us make them better. He added a number of new initiatives through the learning process, and he was a quick learner. And the third thing he did is he expanded involvement of both the people we deal with in the private sector and how we deal with them in the private sector. So without any further details, let me introduce Charlie McKenna.
Thanks, Joe. And here's, I just want to note for everybody who's listening to this, Joe's picture was taken recently, and it's a rather thin picture of Joe, and the fat picture of me is up there. So there's unfairness to that. Joe is very kind because I write his check. And I just want to note that while there's a lot of people here from the private sector, and I appreciate that, there's also a lot of people from various agencies and states along the eastern seaboard. And I think there's a good lesson to be learned here about how to orient the new boss to your way of thinking, all the while letting the boss think that it's their idea when they come in. You have to look, and as these folks did it at OHS&P, you have to look at getting a new person at the top as an opportunity to further your own agenda, which is really what a lot of people who are going to talk today really did. Because when I got here, they had a fairly robust private sector outreach, but it was one that wasn't necessarily supported as well as it could have been from the top. I think that when I got here, they really wanted to let me know how good the private sector outreach was. And my way of thinking, and certainly the way of thinking of many here, was that the private sector is absolutely imperative to any response to any catastrophic event. If we look at 9/11, for instance, and we look at the fact that in mere days after the events of 9/11, the horrific events of 9/11, that Wall Street was able to get up and running. It really wasn't the government that helped them. It was Wall Street itself and private industry getting up and running. That was an amazing accomplishment for a number of reasons. One, it got the financial engine of this country back up and running. But I think sometimes even more importantly, psychologically, for the people of the United States and certainly for the people in New York City and New Jersey and Connecticut, it showed that no matter what happened, that this country was going to get up, it was going to dust itself off, and it was going to put one foot in front of the other. And that being able to see that the country was moving forward after such a tragedy was important psychologically for all the people that were watching that. When you contrast that with Katrina, where after Katrina it seemed as though the government couldn't get out of its own way, the people quickly lost faith in the government, and you saw the beginnings of anarchy there. So we see that it's vitally important that we get the private sector up and running and doing what it does so well, and then frankly the rest of us in government can just walk away and go home because private industry is going to do what needs to be done to get this country back and working. I think the real challenge that we had was how to more fully engage the private sector. And we did a number of things, I think, that are going to be talked about here today. They all involve time and effort, but the return on the investment is so much greater than the investment itself that this is really what you have to do. And at the base of all of this, I think timely, relevant information is the key to any really good engagement and good partnership. If you don't engage in a meaningful cooperation or meaningful conversations with your partner, then you're going to be out on the street and you're going to be looking for another partner. I mean, it's no different than marriage. I mean, if you're not having good, relevant communications with your husband or your wife, the marriage is just going to die on the vine, and it's not going to be any good. So when the hurricane was on its way, we had to come up with a way to really meaningfully communicate timely and relevant information to our partners in the private sector so that they would be armed with the information that they needed to do what they did best, which was to get us back up and running and to make sure that the citizens of the state had the vital services that they needed, water, electricity, power, gas, electric, food, water, and everything else that comes along with the lifestyle that we've come to love so much in this country. So we wanted to make sure that we got that information out. And I do what I always do when I have a dilemma. I turn to Dennis Quinn and I say, here's our problem, Dennis, fix it. And then Dennis goes about making sure that we fix it. And so what I'll do is I'll turn it over to Dennis to really talk about the logistics of how we went about getting our communications out in a timely fashion and relevant communications to everybody in the or as many people as we could in the private sector so that they would be armed with what they needed. So Dennis?
Thanks, Charlie. I thought it may be helpful for everybody who are not familiar with how we do things in New Jersey to maybe go back a little bit into the beginning. By the way, my picture just came up on the screen, and I have no idea where that picture came from, so I know my staff down there has never seen me smile before, but that's me smiling in case you haven't seen it. But I thought it was...
You're not fat there, Dennis, though. I'm the only fat one on the thing today.
So I thought it would be good to go back in 2001, right after 9/11. The state passed the Domestic Security Preparedness Act. That act created the Domestic Security Preparedness Task Force, the Domestic Security Preparedness Planning Group, and more importantly for the purpose of this called Infrastructure Advisory Committee, which was a mechanism to incorporate the private sector into domestic security planning. So way back in 2001, we started a small group of chemical facilities and banking facilities, petroleum, energy, as advisors to the Domestic Security Preparedness Task Force. And we sort of created this relationship with them over a period of time, building trust with that community and to engage them in our planning and exercising. But when the Department of Homeland Security merged soon after that, things changed and we sort of morphed what we were doing into complying with how the Fed sort of put it together. So I've asked a few of my staff, I'm not sure who's down there, but Joe Connery or Sherry Block, talk a little bit about how we moved from the early days of engaging the private sector back in 2001 to how we do it now through the Infrastructure Advisory Committee, how we structure it, how we meet, what the agenda is, and how we work together. So Sherry or Joe?
Dennis, it's Sherry. Essentially, just to discuss the evolution of things, initially, the Infrastructure Advisory Committee is a statutorily mandated advisory committee to the Domestic Security Preparedness Task Force. And the statute itself lists the number of sectors that have to be represented on the Infrastructure Advisory Committee. And we've since that time added a number of sectors and subsectors to that because they're important to New Jersey. Initially, one of our first activities was to do best security practices and best management practices for the sectors that were included in our Infrastructure Advisory Committee. Over a period of time, and I'm really collapsing 10 years into less than 10 minutes, much less than 10 minutes. Over a period of time, the Infrastructure Advisory Committee became most active through what we call sector working groups. And at the national level, DHS refers to those entities as sector coordinating councils. So the sector working groups and members of OHSP staff as well as sector-specific agencies coordinate together on a number of different preparedness activities and have ongoing interaction through those working groups. So that's kind of explains the way our IAC morphed into sector working groups and that we currently do business. And it was through the relationships that we established through that process, not only, having ongoing interaction with critical infrastructure and key resources, but also having fairly robust databases that allowed us to reach out to those owner-operators and security managers so that we can do the work that we need to do. And, part of the issue with getting ready for Irene, other elements in OHSP's front office actually started an outreach effort, which I'm not going to go into too deeply because it really belongs to someone else. Started an interaction and an outreach with what I'll call the big box stores things that we don't consider, that don't meet critical infrastructure criteria and don't appear in the national asset taxonomy, but that were very important to getting us back to where we needed to be after Irene. And with that, I'll pass it back to you, Dennis.
Thanks, Sheriff. So I think the key to this section here is that we have the Infrastructure Advisory Committee. It's co-chaired by both our office and somebody from the private sector. We meet regularly with them 4 times a year. We also meet with the sector working groups on a more regular basis. We get this constant feedback and touching with the private sector, that we're able to hear what their concerns are, address their concerns at the IAC level, and eventually, if it needs to go to the Domestic Security Preparedness Task Force, we can do that. So, and the big thing is that the private sector helps us to drive the agenda. So where the private sector thinks we should be going in our state, they help put that agenda together for us. But Sherry mentioned one of the things that's most important is how we communicate with the private sector. So to do that, we need to build a database. So in our state, we have something called the State Asset Database. And we have, again, Joe and Sherry that sort of manage that. But essentially, there's over 3,500 assets in a database with 7,000 contacts. And that's sort of the basis of how we communicate. But it's a little bit more than that. So Sherry or Joe, if you want to chime in about that.
Yeah, thanks, Dennis. The State Asset Database is a database that was created in the early years really to collect information on what the state had identified as critical infrastructure and key resources originally prior to DHS establishing what we now know as the 18 CIKR sectors. And as time went on, we have identified assets, infrastructure sites that we prioritize, those that meet the national criteria through the annual DHS data calls and as meeting their taxonomy, things that are of significance to the state but don't quite rise to the level of meeting the national, we refer to as state assets, and then all other things that meet the infrastructure taxonomy by virtue of what they are or what they do, but are of yet lesser significance or consequence, we refer to as local assets. Currently, the database contains information on infrastructure sites somewhere in the neighborhood of 3,500 assets. And in addition to what sector and subsector they're in, we normally collect some basic information on the facility to describe and either quantify or qualify what it is, what it does, how it does it, or what makes it important. We also collect points of contact for each of those facilities and have the ability currently to reach out to over 7,000 contacts, both in the public sector, private sector, including state, county, local agencies, and law enforcement. And what that does, and by virtue of the way the database is established, we can sort either the infrastructure information or the contact information and filter them, whether it be by the sector and subsector, whether it be by the asset level, or whether it be by a geographic region, so that we have the ability to reach out to people and share information either across the entire spectrum of assets throughout the state, or if it's something that's a little more localized to several counties in the southern part or the central part, or if it only affects chemical or commercial facilities, we can distribute information on a limited basis. And so all of that information really provides us and gives us the ability to share information with DHS and our partners in other federal and state agencies, and more importantly, or more specific to the recent task at hand during the hurricane, it really forms the backbone for our information sharing and outreach programs that proved quite important and quite critical over that long weekend, in late August. That's it. Back to you, Dennis.
Thanks, Joe. So one of our new things we're involved with now, and I think it's very exciting, it's something that's being generated through Sherry's shop, is a private sector exercise program. So this is sort of an exercise program designed explicitly for the private sector and for critical infrastructure. We sort of engage them at a variety of different levels through several different funding sources. We have the Regional Catastrophic Planning Grant, where Sherry's running a SIP program to evaluate power and evaluate some other utilities. We have the UASI funding to support UASI exercise program. We're leveraging port security funding to do a very extensive private sector port security exercise. But Ron Stryker is sort of our lead on that, and he's developed a sort of a multi-year strategy on how to engage the private sector in meaningful exercises, to do gap analysis of the things that we need to do better from a state perspective and address those gaps. So Ron, if you want to sort of jump in there.
Thanks, Dennis. Well, we saw a need to try to get a sense of whether or not the protective measures we were taking were effectively buying down risk. As one metric, one way to understand it, we saw exercise as a way. We also recognized that while we were conducting a lot of exercises in the public sector, for the most part, private sector was only invited to observe the exercises, and we never really addressed their issues and their concerns. So in fiscal year 10, we sought an investment justification that would help us develop a strategy to address the private sector exercise need. And so our strategy is to conduct a series of Homeland Security exercise and evaluation program, 8-step compliant, contractor facilitated, discussion-based exercises. And these exercises can take the shape of either a seminar or a workshop or a tabletop, depending upon the best fit. We focus the exercise on the lifeline sectors: transportation, energy, telecommunications, water, and information technology, and on the high-risk sectors based by threat and subsectors of commercial facilities, financial services, stadiums, malls, casinos, and emergency services. Using the HF methodology to produce an after-action report and an improvement plan that will document the major strengths and areas of improvement, and hopefully identifying the responsible agency that can address the gap. Our SIP sector work group liaisons, the sector work groups are a subset under the Infrastructure Advisory Committee that work in our sector partnership model with the private sector. And our goal was to work with these folks to develop the policies, plans, and procedures necessary to address the identified gaps. The goal of the exercise is to develop a better understanding of dependencies and interdependencies in the lifeline sectors, to provide owner-operators and government with the knowledge to effectively prioritize resources and support services, to allow our intelligence bureau the opportunity to analyze and provide predictive analysis to those high-risk sectors, and ensure that the participants have executable policies, plans, and procedures in place to react to a specific incident, and ultimately, hopefully, to reduce risk. Today, we've conducted two exercises we've completed in this program. We have one more scheduled for October, one more for November, and one more for December. The first one we did in this series was called Operation Double Down, and it was a casino exercise designed to discuss procedures, resources, and methods to acquire, analyze, and share information regarding suspicious activity to detect and deter a terrorist event. And this was with the 11 casino properties in Atlantic City. The second one that we embarked on was called OASIS, an information sharing exercise that discussed systems, models, and tools used to share information in support of CIKR facilities during the response and recovery phases of a disaster. We're running one on October 18th called Running on Empty, and it's an exercise in the patrolling sector involving storage and distribution in the supply chain, looking at the downstream impacts of the ability to deliver fuel to the end user. We're doing Running on the Bulls in November, which is a commercial facilities arena subsector exercise that will examine procedures utilized during the response phase of a mass evacuation of the Red Bull Arena, a soccer stadium in the state that holds 25,000 people. Exercises under development include one in the financial services sector,
where we will examine the longer-term recovery phases of a disaster, an exercise in the government facilities higher education subsector that will examine critical infrastructure protection, communications, and on-site incident management, an exercise in the water sector, the purpose to be determined through a C&O in November, and a workshop in the public health sector scheduled for the fall of 2012. The way forward, our planning continues as we enhance our sector partnership model through what to date has been a successful exercise program, well received by the private sector. Again, we look forward to delivering at least 5 more exercises in 2012 and 2 more after that in the first half of 2013. We encourage our sector work group partners to work through their Bureau liaisons and if they have an issue that they would like to address with a seminar or workshop or a tabletop. All yours, Dennis.
Thanks. So I guess the most important part of the agenda then was, how do we engage the private sector during an emergency? And I think that's one of the first questions that Charlie had asked when he came on board, maybe after he got his feet wet and understood what we're all doing, is how do we engage the private sector during an emergency? How do we talk to them? How do we know what their needs are? How do they communicate back to us what's going on out there? So we came up with a couple of ideas. One was the establishment of a private sector desk at the State Emergency Operations Center that would be activated during a Level 3 activation of the state EOC. And also to do a private sector outreach where we built a database of private sector that we thought were, that should get pre-briefings on upcoming hurricane, a private sector that could help us during emergency, a private sector that's so critical to the state that we wanted them to have information as soon as we had it. So we put together a list of about 200 private sector, including big box stores, food and industry, financial sector, power, water, telecom, and insurance. We tested the network on a communicator maybe a month before the hurricane hit us to make sure it worked, to find out what their needs were, what kind of information they wanted. And then during the course of the pre-hurricane, the hurricane itself, and the recovery, Charlie, myself, Joe, and other staff did conference calls every day with the private sector to brief them on the weather, to brief them on what the state agencies are doing, road closings, environmental issues, power issues, utility, telecom issues. We had somebody from state EOC brief out on the activities of the state EOC. We had the ROC private outreach do briefing on intel and anything else that they wanted to bring out to the private sector. We had FEMA, the private sector outreach, brief out. The Department of Homeland Security, Protective Security Advisor did a briefing. We had sector-specific briefings from the private sector back to us, where power, telecom, water, big box stores all sort of briefed out to us what they were seeing out in the field. So it became sort of a two-way street of getting information from them of what they were seeing on the ground and what we were seeing from radar and some other tools that we had. And I think engaged us with them to the point where there's a lot of problem solving done. And I think sometime during this presentation, we can talk a little bit about one of the big things that we worked on, and as a result of this conference call that we were able to restore water to 800,000 people or stop them from losing it just by working together with the private sector to solve problems. So that was one of the things that we did on a daily basis. We did the conference calls. We had identified a private sector list, again, of the big box stores, of the banks, of certain facilities that are critical during times of emergency, facilities that we may need to get supplies from to help the population recover. So the whole, a very complicated list of private sector. We did a communicator test with them every day where we sent out emails, phone calls, text messages to make sure they were on the call. And we had pretty much everybody on the call every morning during the storm. But we also established a private sector desk, and I think that was key because now we actually had a desk in the State Emergency Operations Center where all the other ESF, emergency support functions, were working on problem solving during the storm. And that was the one piece that was missing. I think Charlie recognized that early on, that the private sector was never fully engaged in the state EOC operations. They may get weather reports and they get specific things, but they really had no way to call in to express concerns or nobody to call into to get any kind of relief for what they're dealing with. So this year, the first time ever, we established a private sector within the State Emergency Operations Center. And Frank Westfall, our Protective Security Advisor from the Department of Homeland Security, and Joe Connery from our office sort of staffed that desk. So Frank or Joe, if you want to talk a little bit about what you guys did and how you interacted with the private sector.
Go ahead.
Oh, yeah, Joe Connery again. Yeah, I mean it was definitely a joint effort, both with OHSP, CIP personnel, our Planning Bureau, DHS Protective Security Advisor Frank Westfall, and one of his counterparts from outside the region came in to back him up, and the folks in the ROC outreach. And on a daily basis, we really did serve as the point of contact for the private sector with inbound communications. The one thing that we, caution them is that, we emphasize on the daily calls that they should work with their local and county Office of Emergency Management and emergency responders for, their routine requests for assistance and resources. But when those networks either fell short, fell on deaf ears perhaps, or they felt that the issues that they were facing would have a much broader, larger consequence, that we were the place to call, because we would be able to field the call, understand the issues, and whether it be sending an email, whether it be making a phone call, or whether it would be walking to another room, grabbing a hold of somebody and sitting down to explain it, passing it up through the chain of command. There were really some major obstacles that were overcome. Early on, we were fortunate that many private sector entities called in prior to the storm really making landfall and getting too severe, to explaining that their contingency plans were reliant upon resources responding from out of state, trucks of personnel, generators, etc. And, in anticipation of running into obstacles, roadblocks, or law enforcement that had shut down the roads, they wanted some assurance that where they'd be able to reach out and get direction when the storm settled down and the troops were coming over the hill. And we were able to give them the direct point of contact or to call us, and we would reach out to our partners that were in the EOC. There are a myriad of things, from facilities that were very close to running out of fuel for backup generation, to facilities that had attempt power restoration through the normal business numbers of the utility, and pretty much were told to take a number and get in line. And we were able to actually connect the dots and explain the circumstances, that the consequence more not so much to the facility or the business entity, but rather to the populace of New Jersey that were reliant on the water, the power, how to get equipment in and out, or the best routes to do that. So the private sector really was key to pointing out the problems, and it's, once they got in to our desk, pretty much was a one-stop shop. Anything you needed to know, we were the Google of the moment on how to fix the problem or who to reach out to, and it really did prove successful in that regard. Frank, do you have anything from the federal perspective?
No, I mean, this is Frank Westfall, the PSA for New Jersey. It was actually a perfect fit for the PSA to be there partnering with New Jersey Office of Homeland Security. As the PSA, DHS had directed me to track certain critical infrastructure that has a national impact, let's say. And PSA? Protective Security Advisor. I apologize. For those who don't know what a PSA is, Protective Security Advisor. So I was able to bring the resources that the federal government has through the PSA program, make that available to New Jersey to help us understand some of the criticality issues we had with the critical infrastructure. Plus, I was also able to reach out directly to the private sector to track the CIKR that DHS wanted information on. So it was a perfect fit. I thought it was very successful, and hopefully we don't have an emergency in the near future, but I look forward to doing it again. So
it's Charlie McKenna again. When I came here, I don't use fancy words like criticality and all that government speak that everybody uses, and what I envisioned was literally a concierge desk, where when you got a problem, you call up the concierge and you say to the concierge, here's my problem, I need this, I need that, I need the other thing, and the concierge takes care of it. That's what we were looking for, and we can gussy it up with all of the words we have, but that's really what we wanted, and that's what we got, a concierge desk for the private sector.
Absolutely.
Dennis?
Thanks, Charlie. So So I think the key to this is that we established that 800 number where the private sector was informed what the number was. They can call in. I think we sort of deemed it impractical to bring all the private sector into a state EOC environment, but there were certain private sectors we did bring in. One would be like the New Jersey Food Council, because food is such a critical asset during a hurricane or a major storm. And they were very instrumental in helping us distribute food around the state, using their assets on a volunteer basis to move food around for us. So in certain cases, it was good. I think part of our after-action evaluation is to really make a determination on, from what we learned at this storm, what private sector should be sitting in the state EOC with us, and again, it's establishing an 800 number so that the rest of the private sector knows that this is institutionalized. It's always going to be there. Desk will always be there. The desk will always be staffed with our people, with our critical infrastructure folks, with the Department of Homeland Security PSA, with the ROC private sector outreach, with the FEMA private sector outreach. And these are the people that can solve the problems for the private sector, and if not, they know where to get the answers from. So that's going to be institutionalized. So that's pretty much all I have on this. I think during the after-action of Irene, that the private sector desk and the private sector outreach got very good reviews from the private sector. So we're going to build that, institutionalize it, and exercise it. So that's all I have. I know Joe wanted to make some final comments on some of the plans moving forward. Joe?
Yeah, just from the future perspective, we've initiated a couple of efforts dealing with the complexity of interdependency. If this breaks, what are we going to do with this other piece of really important private sector enterprise or critical infrastructure? So in that regard, we're working to develop, and we're starting around Exit 14, a model to look at the industry, the lifeline sectors in that area, and provide and develop a leadership tool that will allow our leaders and the private sector to understand the implications of making and taking an action, and what happens when we bring power back to this area versus this area, and what's more critical, getting a hospital online versus getting roadway cleared. So that's an effort that's ongoing right now. The contractor's on board and has begun work. And we're going to move and take a more expanded approach, looking at the entire Port of New York and New Jersey, both sides of the river, working with New York City and the Coast Guard, looking at all the critical owner and operators and facilities around the port, and determine again what do we need to know in the event of a major event, what we should do first, and how we should be coordinating. Thanks, Dennis.
Okay, so Tom, Laura, I think that's it for us. We'll open up the questions for Charlie, myself, for Joe, Sherry, anybody who's on the phone call. We're willing to take questions.
Okay, great. So just a reminder to everyone, there's two ways to answer questions. You can use the hand icon on your screen to raise your hand, but remember you need to have dialed in with your 2-digit PIN code to enable me to unmute you. So I see a hand raised by Kurt Ruther from earlier on, but you're not connected yet with your PIN code. So, but I do have a couple questions. One, who funds the Private Sector Help Desk?
There's no funding involved. This is just our staff that are sitting at the desk and the federal government. When the state EOC is activated, we all start assigning staff for different functions or essential employees. So we don't have to fund that desk. We just provide staff for it, and we pick up the salaries associated with that, and it comes out of our normal day-to-day salary accounts.
My feeling is on this, I don't know if you can hear me on this, but my feeling is that everybody who works for me has two jobs. They have the job for me that they do every day, and then they have the job for me that they're going to do when there's an event. And what we did was we just took our people that normally would be working, and we shifted them over to the EOC, and they became our private sector desk, and Frank Westfall just didn't get a lot of sleep. So that's how that worked.
Okay, thank you. I just unmuted the phone for Matthew Wall from VITA. Matthew, do you have a question?
Hi, I hope everybody's doing well. Yes, ma'am. What I typed in was that in essence, for an organization or a business to be functional during an event, all of this that I'm hearing here is showing an assumption that everything is going to be up and running and functional. Was there any outreach by the state of New Jersey or by the Homeland Security people to be able to assure or be able to help the businesses to make sure that they're going to be up and running and therefore effective partners in the course of before the course of the event, so that they would be functional during the event?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the whole purpose of this. The first thing that went on was, for instance, the governor ordered evacuations to begin at a certain period of time. A lot of the retailers in that area said, look, we don't want to close right then. We need to stay open because it's not going to help us on the back end. So, we went to the governor and we said, look, these stores want to stay open, and so they got extra time to stay open. The whole idea of the help desk, or the concierge desk, as it were, was if they needed something, we were going to get it for them. So we had a water company that after Hurricane Floyd had built a wall around it so that it wouldn't flood again, and it worked very effectively. The flood waters did not reach the facility, although you couldn't get to the facility. The power went out around there. They couldn't get to the facility to fuel their backup generators. So we were able, through PSE&G, to deal with getting their power back on for them, to the point where, and this is what's important about these relationships that you build well before these events occur. When we had, let's say, trouble with a certain PSE&G contingent that didn't understand what it was we wanted to do and weren't taking us seriously, we were able to get on the phone with the president of PSE&G, explain what we were doing, and were able to reorient, let's say, that group of PSE&G employees so they got on board with us. So the whole purpose of this is to get companies back up and running as quickly as possible, to deal with those problems that they would otherwise not really have a place to air them, and then to get them fixed for them. So that's really the way we went about this.
This is Joe Picciano. Just to add on what Charlie was saying, from the planning perspective, the model is bringing business back to business is key to our success. And in that sort of positioning, we pre-worked with the food industry, identifying their critical points of distribution, and provided targeted areas where if we needed, we'd be able to provide security, backup power. We understand the significance of specific sectors getting back to business for recovery. So we do a lot of specific planning with state investments, and the food industry is one. We have other initiatives going on with big box stores, with energy providers in our state, again, for the sole purpose of getting business back to business. So we do it two ways. We are reactive in a sense with the cell, but as Charlie indicated, we have a lot of work that we do ahead of time to ensure that we're helping business get back to business.
I mean, my bottom line is I don't want to have to give out food and water if I can get the Walmart store open and they can get the food and water logistically much easier than I can.
Agreed. Thank you.
Thanks, Matthew, for that question. We have unmuted the phone for Jan Opper. Jan? Jan, you still there?
Our government speaks, I put her to sleep. We do that at that time.
Yeah, I had a question for Joe Picciano. You were talking about a dependency tool you have a contract out for. What is the timing on developing that?
Hey, Jan, haven't heard from you in a long time.
Yeah, that's right.
Basically, it's already been awarded to Good Harbor, which is
I know.
Dick Clark's firm, and basically they're in the process of developing a decision model, looking at the sectors, doing actual field visits, determining the outside defense requirements. Again, back to the earlier question, we want to know what industry needs to be operative and the time they need to be operative in the event of a recovery. We expect to have the initial model completed within 3 or 4 months and work to begin in earnest in development of the model in probably 6 or 7 months. We've worked with our PSA, you heard who talked a little earlier in doing this, and with DHS, and we're building on work that DHS put together on Exit 14 in the past. We're going to take that same approach, and this is on the street right now. We're going to take that same approach and do it for the entire Port of New York, working with the Coast Guard in New York City. And again, the ultimate endpoint is for us to be able to really provide decision makers an opportunity to understand what the consequences are of their decisions in bringing business back to business.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Jan. I unmuted the phone for Earl Zilke. He written in a question here, which I'll read, but I also unmuted just in case, Earl, you wanted to speak as well. Did you identify or establish a standard statewide assessment program for conducting CIKR assessments to ensure criticality and ranking was addressed uniformly?
Right. This is Dennis Quinn. We do, within our shop, have the Critical Infrastructure Protection Bureau. Within their mission is actually go out and do critical assessments of all facilities in the state. They do vulnerability assessments, risk assessments. Sherry, if you want to expound on that, you or Joe?
Well, the only thing I would say about that was it didn't have a lot to do with what we did in this particular mission. I mean, we do a number of assessments. We do work cooperatively with our PSA. We are actively working to try to understand dependencies among and between different asset systems and networks. But in terms of our sector working groups, it's those active members of the sector. When it comes to the lifeline sectors, we all know which assets we need to be concerned about and which ones everyone depends on. They're some of our most active participants in everything we do. So yes, while we do a number of different types of assessments of different types of facilities, it didn't really have that much to do with this particular function with respect to Hurricane Irene.
And look, while we run the private sector desk, you know, when the requests come in, we're obviously triaging them to make sure that we deal with the biggest problems, the ones that are going to affect the most people first. But a lot of this is frankly seat of the pants during the event.
So you guys can hear me now? Is that what I'm being told?
Yeah. Out and clear.
Okay, Earl Zolke from Illinois, thank you. No, maybe my question is somewhat of a tangent and not, you know, really specifically in the area you're talking about today for the private sector, but what we've seen in Illinois is there's a number of different methodologies that have been developed to do critical facility assessments. You know, MISRAM is a maritime-based terrorist tool. Carver has been used from buffer zone protection plan, and on and on and on. And the problem we see is these different methodologies have different criteria and scoring mechanisms. So when you're trying to look at, as somebody said earlier, buying down risk with our you know, critical funds that are available, and now we have to arbitrate between one facility or entity that's saying, I've got the most critical facility, and somebody else says, well, no, I've got the most critical facility, and now we're trying to compare them, apples to oranges. You know, it's somewhat can be problematic.
I agree with you, and I've sat at meetings for like 3 hours and fallen asleep for long periods of time while they debate this. So why don't I give you Sherry Black's number, and you can talk to her ad nauseum on this at 609-631-7479. She'd be more than happy to chat.
7179?
7479.
479.
Okay.
Sherry Black, thank you. I will do that.
Perfect.
This is Joe, by the way, and just to, I mean, I fall asleep.
Oh, stop.
Yeah, but one of the other things to keep in mind is we've sort of said, you know, all that stuff is important, but most importantly is what's happening outside the fence, and understanding what's important for that piece of infrastructure to be operational. It's really where we're spending a lot of our energy now. That's why we're doing these studies and really finding out really what the dependencies are and what do we need to do outside the fence as opposed to all the other stuff that's going on.
But that does directly tie in, you know, identifying the criticality of a facility and knowing its interdependencies across various sectors, you know, is something that obviously you do have to consider, and that's what we're trying, you know, we're doing it also. But I'm saying that if you're basing some of your decision making on variant programs that are somewhat, you know, they're not congruent to each other, or they don't use the same, you know, methodology. So, okay, I can do this offline. I don't want to take up your time. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thanks for the question.
Thank you. It looks like we have a written question from earlier. I'm not sure if it's been addressed. Is asset database PC2 or classified?
The state asset database is not PCII or classified. We do protect it. It's protected under our domestic security preparedness task force protections, but it's not PCII.
We don't give it out for like a freedom of information request or what we call in the state, the state analog being an Open Public Records Act request.
Okay, that was all the questions that we had. Did you have any closing comments?
It's Charlie McKenna again. I'll just kick it off by saying, you know, it's really the relationships that you forge before these events that are really what's going to get you through the event itself. And granted, during that event, you want to be able to get timely, relevant information out to everybody so that they can make decisions based upon that. But there are times when you've got to make the phone call to the right person. You've got to know who that person is, and the Rolodex becomes the most important thing that you have.
Very true. And on the screen now, if you're on the GoToWebinar platform, you'll see the URL for the All Hazards Consortium website. And under our Resources tab is where we're going to post a copy of the YouTube recording from today's webinar, but we'll also send a link to all of today's attendees. And on behalf of the All Hazards Consortium, I'd like to thank the entire Office of Homeland Security and Preparedness for State of New Jersey, as well as their partners, especially Joe Picciano, Dennis Quinn, and Charlie McKenna for putting this webinar together today. Thank you so much, and this hereby ends our webinar. Have a great day.